Hello, everyone. Welcome to Brainwaves. I'm Brandon Staglin, your host. When I first started filming this show as the host and the producer and the one-man show back in 2011, that was Brainwaves, I started with an actual online, on-location filming with a scientist at UCSF named Dr. Vikas Sohal. And this first episode was the beginning of what is now a 10-year span of great episodes about science and advocacy and the great things happening, making waves in brain science and brain health advocacy today. But the core of the show is still about science. And that's why today we have two amazing guests who are scientists, and we're going to talk about their wonderful, groundbreaking work. As it does every year, One Mind's Music Festival for Brain Health is bringing together passionate advocates, acclaimed musicians, superstar chefs and vintners, and of course, pivotal innovative scientists to support the acceleration of brain health research. This year's event takes place on September 11th, and we're so excited to have two of these scientists doing these groundbreaking research works with us today who will be actually celebrated at that event. They are two of One Mind's 2021 Rising Stars. Later in the program, we'll check in with our team at One Mind Cyber Guide for their review of an app that is a mental health app that can actually help using personalized tools and daily meditations to help manage anxiety. But first, tickets are still available for the accompanying live stream of the Music Festival for Brain Health on September 11th. The virtual event features a very special performance by three-time Grammy winner Branford Marsalis and the great jazz pianist Joey Calderazzo as a duo. Here's a piece called Breeze Dance that they will perform. Take a look. see Branford and Joey's performance at the virtual live stream of the Music Festival for Brain Health on September 11th. Hope you will register and get your tickets today at www.music-festival.org. Please check it out. Joining me now are two of One Mind's Rising Star Awardees for 2021. Dr. Sarah Stern is the research group leader at the Stern Lab at the Max Planck Florida Institute for Neuroscience. And Dr. Devanand Manoli. He's an assistant professor of psychiatry at the University of California at San Francisco, where he heads up the Manoli Lab. Sarah and Dave, thank you so much for joining us, and welcome again to Brainwaves.
Thank you.
Great to have you both on the show. And viewers, don't forget, if you have any questions or comments for our guests or for One Mind during the show, please post them in the comment section of this webcast anytime you feel ready. Thank you. So Sarah, may I start with you?
Sounds good.
All right, let's hit it. Sarah, you've been awarded the One Mind Donna Friedman Rising Star Award for your groundbreaking research into an area that affects so many people, but is actually very understudied in science. Your work at the Stern Lab involves looking at the brain's insular cortex circuits to understand eating disorders. How does the brain's insular cortex, what exactly does it do, and how does it figure into eating disorders, and how does studying it, how can that help us lead to a better understanding of the maladaptive eating behaviors that surround eating disorders?
Yeah, so the insular cortex, like eating disorders, is actually a very understudied brain region. So, if we think about some of these more popularly studied regions like amygdala, hippocampus, hypothalamus, that have sort of like made their way almost into pop culture, the insular cortex is like in no man's land. So, and part of the reason is, at least in rodents, the insular cortex is on the lateral sides of the brain. So it's all the way at the side. And for some of the techniques that we use, it makes it a little bit hard to reach. But in recent years, there's been a lot of human imaging studies that have started to look at the insular cortex, and they've sort of converged on this hypothesis that the insular cortex, or they call it the insula, is important for this process called interoception, which is how our body sort of senses itself. So like, how do we know that we are hungry or tired or anxious? We have to sense the internal state of our body. And so the insular cortex is sort of hypothesized to do that, but we still really don't understand the neural mechanisms by which that happens. And so another hypothesis is that a lot of psychiatric disorders might arise from dysfunctions in this interoception process, that if you can't understand how you feel, then your responses to stimuli in the environment, become maladaptive. And so because one of those aspects of interoception is hunger, we hypothesize that the insular cortex is really important for understanding how to respond to hunger and satiety signals, and that if there's dysfunction in that understanding, that's how these maladaptive behaviors arise.
That is amazing. Thanks for explaining that. That was really easy to understand. And so how do you think that studying the insular cortex can shed light on ways that eating disorders could be treated?
Yeah, so I think that we've spent a lot of time in the field of feeding on genetics and trying to understand, what are genes that underlie obesity or even eating disorders. But we know that, these feeding behaviors are complex, and they're a lot like other psychiatric disorders or mental health disorders that involve both genes and environment. And so part of what we're trying to do is to develop new animal models, behavioral models, so that we can actually look at these environmental aspects and test how the insular cortex is involved in that, and what we can do to try to help treat those disorders. And so another aspect of my research that I'm really passionate about is transcriptomics, and finding novel targets for drug development and for therapeutic interventions. And so we try to find cell types within the insular cortex that are characterized by specific genes, so that then we can try to target those genes for new drugs and new therapies.
Wow, that sounds really encouraging that you have a possible pathway that you can pursue. When you find out what exactly is going on within the insular cortex, you can target those cells within the insular cortex with potential treatments down the line. That gives me a lot of hope to hear that.
Yeah, I mean, one thing that I'll add is that, in comparison to other mental health disorders, there's no FDA approved drugs for eating disorders. So that's something that I think really needs to be addressed. And so that's part of why we're hoping to do these studies.
That could help so many people. Thank you for your great work. And Dave, let's turn to you for a moment. You are the winner of the Unwind Jansen Rising Star Translational Research Award for 2021. Congratulations. And this is in memory of Jeffrey S. Nye for your work in sensory and neural mechanisms underlying social attachment. And to study these sensory and neural mechanisms, you work with prairie voles. Why do you work with prairie voles? How do these kind of cuddly rodents, how do their behaviors and functioning in their brain, how does that translate into human attachment and bonding functioning and behaviors?
Thank you, Brandon, both for the award, and actually I think you also answered the question by talking about the cuddliness of the rodents. They are actually quite adorable. But sort of at a general level, the short answer to the question of why to work with prairie voles is that they form long-term social attachments as adults. And so what does that translate to? It means that prairie voles fall into the category of about 4 to 5% of mammals that form these sort of complex social behaviors, in particular what we call social monogamy as adults. And so what that lets us do is it really allows us to begin to answer the question of how do you form a social memory? How do you incorporate your experience with a specific individual or individuals and allow that to guide behavior both in the moment, but then also later in life. And so, I don't think I need to belabor the point of how important social relationships are sort of in general to human society and civilization, but then also how much they can be disrupted in the context of various psychiatric disorders. And so prairie voles, by virtue of forming this bond, in particular, a pair bond is what we call it, between mates, form a relationship that not only encodes a specific individual and therefore how you behave to that individual versus others, but it actually translates into how you actually change your behavior over the course of time once you form this bond. So I'm just I'll use a very specific example. So between prairie voles, in contrast to the vast majority of other rodents, for example, when mates meet each other, and mate with each other, they form a bond that actually causes them to prefer the company of their pair bonded mate versus novel individuals. And so that's in contrast to, for example, with mice, which novelty actually is sort of the driving force. And so then you get to ask the question, how does an animal actually create this drive to actually spend time with its partner? How does it recognize its partner, which is part of what this award is about, is how does it take the specific sensory cues? For us, it's the face of our loved ones, or maybe the voice of our loved ones. How do we take that and evoke an emotional response that drives us to actually want to spend more time with our partners or with our loved ones? And then another really interesting sort of correlate that we can also look at in the lab is how does that change our behavior towards other individuals? And so, for example, for a prairie vole, what that means is that whether it's a male or a female, once it's bonded, the next time it meets a novel opposite sex potential mate, it actually actively rejects them. And so that actually is a really profound transformation in what is a pretty innate behavior in terms of the drive to mate. But that also sort of lets us get to the concepts of how do we transform those that we sort of identify with or that we're affiliated with in terms of our preference for those individuals versus how we react to maybe novel or foreign individuals sort of that aren't necessarily part of our experience or immediate environment. And you can imagine that has lots of implications, both in terms of anxiety responses, but also in terms of just normal human behavior. How do we sort of treat individuals that we're more or less familiar with? And then the other really interesting thing that prairie voles allow us to do is to look at what is the experience of loneliness, right? Because these are these are animals that actually prefer social company. They prefer those that they're familiar with, either with their mates or earlier in life, they form same-sex affiliative bonds. But then that also allows us to explore what is it that the animal perceives or what is evoked in the brain when an animal is alone. And so that sort of creates a very challenging neuroscience question in terms of what is the experience of the absence of something. But for an animal that is very social and prefers to be, we can then sort of take that information and really try to understand how is it that that causes distress or some of the sort of physiologic or neural correlates of that.
Mm-hmm. And I imagine that understanding how these prairie voles experience loneliness and what happens in their brains during loneliness, and also how they form these pair bonds, what happens in the brains during pair bonding, could shed light on human experience. I mean, what you described is really easy to understand as well, and it sounds very resonant to me in my own experience with the people in my family, my wife, my family, friends. I imagine you have goals about how we can use this information once you discover it, in terms of helping people who experience psychiatric conditions like autism or schizophrenia to live like healthier lives through better social functioning. Do you have thoughts about that?
Yeah, so I think that's a perfect segue to sort of the specifics of a little bit about what this award is about. So one of the things that we know for patients you mentioned with who are experiencing schizophrenia or symptoms of autism is that they perceive sort of general sensory information in a different way. And that becomes particularly relevant when we think about social interaction. So, again, I'll just use the example of, for humans, it's facial expressions, for example. How do we sort of recognize facial expressions? How do we correlate them with emotions? There's also, for example, a really great body of literature that really has sort of been pioneered in autism research, looking at what we call biological motion. So the idea that a human being moves very differently than, for example, a robot that, if it was walking. And so not only does that sort of information become really, really important just for navigating the everyday world, but obviously how we perceive emotions and, for example, facial expressions is how we interact with each other and how we form relationships. How do we generally get the intonation of somebody's vocal expression, right, when they're telling a joke versus they're telling a sad story, things like that. And so what we're trying to understand is at what level of sensory processing do disruptions occur in the context, for example, of mutations in genes that are associated with some of these psychiatric illnesses? Is it at the very sort of peripheral or external level of how we sort of recognize visual information, or for a prairie vole, how it might smell its mate and recognize that individual? Or is it how that translates into how do I identify one versus the other? Or do I respond in a sort of proactive, pro-social way? Or do I respond in an anxious way? Do I somehow, regardless of the information of whether it's a familiar or a non-familiar individual, does it evoke, for example, anxiety responses? And so at each of those steps, when we understand where and how these are occurring regularly and how they get disrupted, we can then sort of specifically design interventions, either behaviorally or, ideally even with combination of pharmacology, to really sort of improve how this information gets processed to sort of evoke positive social experiences.
Wow, well, that is fascinating. And I remember back when I was more symptomatic with the schizophrenia that I experienced, I was more anxious about meeting people and talking with people, and I found it very hard to form friendships, and let alone a pair bond with somebody for be a spouse one day. And it was using treatments, variety of things, including medication and cognitive training and just practicing being with people, that over time helped me to feel more comfortable with people and ultimately form good relationships again. So I can see the value in the work that you're doing could help accelerate that process for so many people who are struggling with that. Thank you.
Thank you.
Absolutely. And Sarah, back to you. We did talk a bit about the therapies that you think might be developed with the work you're doing on the insular cortex and eating disorders. Do you have specific ideas about what types of therapies could be developed in terms of your goals for your project?
Yeah, I think we're still a little bit in early days to make anything specific predictions. I think my main goal is to try to sort of bring eating disorders research to the level that we already have for other mental health disorders. I think it's so far behind and so lacking. So, part of my main goal is to sort of like build up these building blocks that already exist for other psychiatric disorders so that then we can make more specific predictions.
Yeah. Yeah, no, that's so important. Got to get the foundation in place before we can start building the therapies that can come from that. Well, kudos to you. Thank you. Yeah, so important. And our thanks to Unwind go out to Donna Friedman for her sponsoring of this award. Thank you for enabling these great building blocks to be put into place, Donna. I hope you're watching. So we're talking today with two of our 2021 Unwind Rising Star Award winners about their cutting-edge research into the neural basis of psychiatric conditions. Dr. Devanand Manoli is Assistant Professor of Psychiatry at University of California, San Francisco, where he heads up the Manoli Lab. And Dr. Sarah Stern is the Research Group Leader for the Stern Lab at the Max Planck Florida Institute for Neuroscience. And viewers, again, thank you so much for watching. If you have any questions or comments for our guests today, please post them in the comment section of this webcast. And if you find that what you're learning today is interesting and you think it might interest somebody that you know and care about, please share this webcast with them. Thanks again. So Sarah, back to you. Let's get a little bit more personal now. What inspired you to go into the field of neuroscience? And why did you want to focus your work on eating disorders? Like what drew you to the field initially?
Yeah, I would say it's not a super straightforward answer. So I sort of got interested in neuroscience because of the Holocaust. So I'm Jewish, and growing up, I was sort of immersed in this, like I would say, inherited trauma of the Holocaust. And I was always really sort of, I would say like mind boggled, like how could people do something like so truly awful? And how can human behavior sort of exist to allow that to happen? And so that got me interested in psychology. I started taking psychology classes in college. And, in like social psychology, you learn about Stanley Milgram's obedience experiment. But all that really tells you is that you can sort of recreate these types of behaviors in a laboratory setting. They don't really tell you how or why humans actually do awful things. So eventually I took a cognitive neuroscience course as part of my major requirements. And it was like, it sort of just clicked. And I was like, oh, there's like biology underlying all these things. And I had never been interested in science before. So I started taking all these neuroscience classes, and I just found it really interesting. And it sort of helped me to understand that we can actually find like biological basis for behavior, and that hopefully that can help us treat mental health disorders or other maladaptive behaviors. And in terms of eating disorders, that's also sort of a circuitous route. I was studying memory during my PhD, like mechanisms of memory consolidation, more thinking about aging and Alzheimer's and cognitive decline. But I've always just been really interested in these questions of mental health. And my mom is a nutritionist, so I've sort of been immersed in the world of food for a long time. And it just became sort of clear to me that there was this lack in the research in terms of feeding. I think both for overeating, binge eating, obesity, and for restrictive eating, we still, tend to think of those as questions of willpower, where it's like, if you just stopped eating, or if, teenage girls just stopped reading fashion magazines, we wouldn't have these problems. Whereas I think for some other mental health disorders, we've sort of bridged that gap a little bit, where people understand that it's not just a question of willpower, right? You can't stop yourself from being depressed just by saying, be happy now, right? But for all of these maladaptive feeding behaviors, we still sort of have these notions that you can just tell someone to change their behavior and they should be able to do it. So just realizing that these gaps existed just made me want to try to address them.
Yeah, that's so important. And you're understanding that the brain has certain biological factors that guide it and influence people's behavior. through your work in understanding psychology and cognitive neuroscience, I think is a great asset to address eating disorders, because it is more than just a question of willpower. People have these changes that take place in their brain, just like with other mental health conditions or even substance use disorders. But there's also a greater stigma attached to eating disorders, I think, than some of the other mental health conditions. Is that part of the reason why there's less research on it, do you think?
I think that there is this idea out there that, that eating disorders are due to like our cultural milieu, and that if we just got rid of models and, magazines, that it would go away, which I think is clearly not true. And I would also guess that there is an element of sexism involved. So because anorexia usually preferentially targets females, and, in science, we've been dominated by, mostly male researchers for such a long time. I think that it's just a disorder that hasn't really been on the forefront of people's minds, because they think of it as only affecting a small proportion of people. But anorexia has the highest mortality rate of any psychiatric disorder. So I think the need is really urgent.
Indeed. Thank you for shedding light on that and for putting in perspective. That really helps understand kind of why there's been less research on it, and how we can address improving the amount of research and address the challenges that people with eating disorders face through perhaps some cultural influence as well, on helping people understand that it's not just a small segment of the population, it's so many people, and it is so morbid and so deadly in many cases.
And can I just add one more thing?
Yes.
I think also for those of us that are studying, animal models of mental health disorders, there's also been this stigma against studying eating disorders in animals, where we say, anorexia is a uniquely human phenomenon and we can't model that in an animal. But mice don't get depressed either, right? We can't ask them if they're depressed. So we use behavioral tasks that model some aspects of these disorders to try to make headway into what the biology is. And so I think that there's no reason that we can't do the same thing for eating disorders using these behavioral models in rodents. And there's just been this, stigma against that for a really long time.
Well, I'm glad you're taking this in the most kind of the most direct way of studying it, these mechanisms in brains that you can use. So thank you for doing the research that you do. I'm glad you're taking this route.
Actually, is it okay if I just want to say thank you to Sarah for that point, because I think that that's really something that I think in mental health research gets very frequently brought up about, how can you study these very complex disorders in an animal model? And, I think Sarah's point is just so, just so timely in terms of thinking about the fact that, sure, there are human specific phenomena, but at the same time, the biology of the brain is very conserved, whether we're talking about feeding behavior, which every animal has to do, whether we're talking about sort of baseline, sort of basic mating and sort of social behaviors, or more complex social behaviors, when we think about the neural circuits, for example, of oxytocin and things like that. So I think that it's really important just to kind of, to really emphasize that point that she's making, that, you can ask questions that are incredibly relevant in a model organism, and then you have to extrapolate that right into how do we sort of understand what's happening. So thanks, Sarah, for making that point.
Yeah, indeed. It's so important to use whatever tools we have available in a humane way, of course, to learn how to help people who are struggling with these really serious conditions. So thank you both for the work that you do. Dave, I want to ask you a similar question that I asked Sarah a minute ago, and that's around your personal background and what interested you in neuroscience, and what intrigued you about socialization and bonding as an area to focus on in your research.
Thanks. So I guess similarly to Sarah, it's kind of a little bit of a circuitous route. I always knew that I was interested in biology, even from in high school. And I was very interested sort of in molecular mechanisms and just sort of how various things happen at a cellular and then sort of multicellular level. And actually my interest in neuroscience came from, I believe I think it was my high school biology teacher, even before then, who gave me a copy of The Mind's Eye by Hofstadter and Dennett. And so just that sort of, at the time, just being a teenager and that self-indulgent sort of, let's think about consciousness sort of view on neuroscience, and really just sort of saying, how does this, sort of mushy thing give rise to something that's actually quite impressive? And so thinking about not only sort of the mental experiences that you can sort of try to translate into behavior and the conscious experience, but then, as I mentioned, I was really interested in things at a molecular level. And so at that time, which was a while back, there was a lot of frustration from people in molecular biology in terms of really being able to gain traction in neuroscience. And so actually through college, I was actually interested in immunology, because that was sort of the breakthroughs of sort of cell cycle and cancer biology and immunology were really coming through. And so from a molecular perspective, it felt like there was some tractability there. And so then when I was transitioning to graduate school, that's sort of when this breakthrough in particular in Drosophila neurobiology really came through, where we started to really see that you had the ability to really understand circuits and how information was being processed in order to give rise to behavior, but then also how the molecular and the genetics built those circuits. And so the idea that you could use innate behavior to really understand very, very complex behaviors became sort of apparent. And I was lucky to be sort of in that area when I was in graduate school. And so then, the second part of your question of how did I get interested in bonding, I think from a certain perspective, relationships are just sort of obviously so fascinating, right? I mean, they just dictate so many aspects of, or if not every aspect of our sort of day-to-day experiences, let alone sort of the very complex questions of how do they actually occur in the brain? And as somebody who also is a psychiatrist, how does that really get disrupted? And so what became very fascinating about bonding in particular was not only that, at least in species that are very social, it's innate, which means that there is a genetic component, right? That means that somewhere you can use the genetics to really identify those circuits. It's not that the brain is just this sort of tabula rasa that gives rise to all of these sort of very complex and interesting behaviors, but that there is an innate component that we can use the molecular genetics to shed light on, right? To start to say, okay, let's look in these areas and then broaden in terms of understanding how these behaviors are encoded. And the other question, which is really a fundamental aspect of neuroscience, which is how do we encode experience to influence behavior, right? So you get both the innate component, but then also this experience-dependent phenomenon of how do we encode a social memory based off of early experiences to influence sort of future patterns of behavior, whether it's from childhood through adulthood or just, meeting that person that then defines, your significant other for the rest of your life.
Yeah, that is so fascinating. And I want to say as an aside, I read that same book, The Mind's Eye by Hofstadter and Dennett, about the same age. I was 13, and it just fascinated me so deeply. And that's what was kind of the genesis of my interest in cognitive science and neuroscience and philosophy of consciousness too. Yeah, no, what you're saying about forming pair bonds, and to me, it's mysterious, and you're plumbing the depths of how that works. But I remember a time when back about 12 years ago, more than that, 14 years ago, I was dating the woman who's now my wife, and we went on a trip, our first trip together, on a backpacking trip. And as we had a great time, but we also had some friction here and there, as new couples often do. But then after our argument settled down, we were bonded, and that bond was still there. And that's when I first understood there's more to a relationship that is really deep than just moment to moment feelings. It goes deeper than that. And that was a really valuable lesson for me and helped me understand that this was the woman I wanted to marry. I often thought about that experience, like what was it taking place in me and in her that formed that bond in us? And so I wonder if your research will shed light on that kind of thing.
I mean, I hope so, because I think that what I think the bond that you're describing really is sort of how social interactions create that sort of foundation of security, right? Whether or not, even if that person isn't there, we have the ability to remember that person, and that gives us comfort, and that gives us solace, right? Or it gives us strength, right, in the context of adversity. And so I think that that's such a critical part, going back to sort of to Sarah's point about interception. like sort of our state becomes defined by our interactions, or at least it becomes incredibly influenced by interactions, both in the moment, but then, as you said, sort of at a more permanent level, right? And that ability to sort of recall, whether it's that social memory or that, you know, the first kiss, or just, you know, hanging out with your family, and that feeling of sort of strength and solace can be incredibly, incredibly important.
Here, here, definitely. Huge, huge benefit for me, definitely. Sarah and Dave, both of you, question for both. We'll start with Sarah. The pandemic has had an impact on the mental and emotional health of all of us in both told and untold ways. And your areas of expertise, eating and socialization, have been disproportionately impacted by the pandemic for so many people. And I think these intertwine in terms of the effects of the pandemic on them. So does your research provide any clues into the long-term behavioral and psychological effects of this prolonged trauma vis-a-vis eating and or socialization?
Yeah, so I mean, one thing I'll say is that I have been like very disheartened by some of the discourse around feeding and COVID. You know, there's been a lot of, well, okay, so we know that obesity puts people at greater risk for adverse effects of being COVID positive. And, you know, back to this question of willpower, so then you get a lot of people that are like, well, people just need to be healthier, eat healthier, and then, you know, this wouldn't be as big of a problem. And I think that what my research has shown in the past, so my past research was looking at a task in rodents that would induce overconsumption based on cues in the environment. And so we know that our brains are attuned to learn about our environment and encode these experiences and change our behavior long term. And so, you know, once these maladaptive feeding behaviors become encoded, they're really hard to change. So, you know, when I hear people address this as just an issue of willpower and why can't they just be healthier, and then, you know, COVID wouldn't be so bad. Yeah, I just find that really upsetting. And especially, there's already research showing that during, you know, all of the quarantines and lockdowns, that feeding behaviors, maladaptive feeding behaviors have been exacerbated. So people with eating disorders have had worsening symptoms. And then in general, there's been a trend towards overeating. And we know that social isolation and stress have really strong impacts on feeding behavior. So yeah, I mean, I hope that, you know, through this, people can start to understand that these aren't really just questions of willpower, and that we really need to do work, both like public health work to improve, like, you know, the stress that people are under and our feeding environments, and to understand like these underlying mechanisms that change feeding behaviors. Because I think that once they're ingrained, they're really hard to change. And I think it also impacts children a lot, right? I mean, we have all these kids that have been sitting at home, you know, everyone is stressed. They're watching a lot more television. We know, you know, part of what my research showed was that cues like television can lead to overeating. So, you know, we're now having these mechanisms that are affecting young children and might affect them for life. So I think, you know, putting our heads in the sand and just saying, oh, this is willpower and they'll just, you know, figure it out, isn't going to be helpful long term.
Absolutely. And I love that you are focusing on cognitive neuroscience as part of the lever that can help people understand that there's more to eating behaviors and potentially maladaptive eating behaviors than meets the eye, and that we need to do more than just say, well, you know, it's your fault, make it go away on your own. It's deeper than that. And so I hope that I can spread more information about your research. Unwind will do this to help people understand the need to focus on this. So I'm really grateful for the work you're doing. And Dave, what do you think about the long-term behavioral and psychological effects of this prolonged trauma on socialization?
I mean, I think that the pandemic has been a very unfortunate, but sort of very powerful experience in terms of looking at how many different ways the disruption of sort of baseline, sort of what we consider normal social interactions can very, very quickly be altered. And your question about the long-term effects, I think only time will tell. I think the utility is also, though, that we can now look at sort of patterns in human populations and really see how it's impacted, sort of in the absence of previous psychiatric illness and in the context of, sort of existing conditions. And certainly that's, at the individual level, that's what we've seen in our own clinic. But I think that, the impacts of, sort of prolonged, but then also systemic social isolation really are going to be long-term. And also, I think probably the fact that we can look at them rigorously, as scientists, will also sort of inform us that there are probably going to be effects that we hadn't previously been able to even observe, let alone quantify, comparing to sort of the earlier places where we've looked for sort of systemic social deprivation, whether it's in the context of war, famine, things like that, where individuals have sort of been forced to disrupt their social environment, just their physical location as well as all of the relationships that they have. The fact that this has happened sort of at a global and systemic level, at every level, whether it's sort of the inability to interact with your friends in workplaces, the inability to directly interact with family members, but then also the consequences for individual families and for example, for children, the area that I work with. What are the consequences at each of those stages, right? Because we have this very unique period in development that kids have now been forced to deal with schooling, regardless of their stage, in a very different environment, forced to deal with having to interact with a two-dimensional friend as opposed to a three-dimensional friend, or a four-dimensional one over time on the playground, right? And so I think that there are many, many different ways that we can sort of that we have been thinking about looking at the impacts of this. And I also think that will translate into, a point, animal models, right? Because we have the ability to sort of say, okay, now how do we rigorously test what happens if I disrupt social interactions in a very specific way? But thinking about it now through the lens of something a little bit more systemic and global.
Yeah, that's fascinating. So do you think that your research can help shed light on the kind of debate on the importance of sending kids back to school in person versus continuing virtual education?
Yeah, I mean, that's a good question in terms of sort of how do we tailor various types of social interactions, right, in an animal model. So certainly the sort of the very direct experiment of what happens when you take a small group of individuals, let's say pups, and you keep them together but prevent them from interacting with more animals. What happens if you prevent them from interacting with maybe more than just one, right? So we can start to sort of say, what are the impacts of various types of isolation and how does that impact, right? It's possible that, we might actually find ways in which we can buffer kids, right? If the need occurs to sort of keep things virtual, how can we sort of enrich their environments so that they're not necessarily experiencing some of the detrimental effects, but also being protected, right?
Wow, that is really fascinating. Okay, well,
jump in for a second.
Please.
Just like, we've been doing some experiments in the lab that we're not designed to get at this question, but I feel like we'll end up addressing it in a way. So, when we measure feeding in mice, we often have to singly house them because we want to get individual measurements. And we know that, social isolation in mice, even though, mice are definitely not as social as prairie voles, but they're still social creatures. And if you socially isolate a mouse, they will immediately lose weight for quite a long time. And so we've been trying to think of ways that we can sort of get around this. And so one thing that we're trying is sort of putting these, clear plastic pieces down the middle of a cage with holes so that the mice can still smell each other and see each other, but they can't directly interact with each other. And so they can't get to each other's foods. And then in a way, as you're saying this, I'm like, oh, it's sort of like Zoom, right? They see each other, but they can't actually get to each other. And so we're sort of already looking at how that will change all sorts of behaviors, in particular feeding for us. But I think that these are ways that in animal models we can sort of ask these questions also.
That is really fascinating, like understanding how the mice experience like being alone, but understanding that they're really not alone, that there are other mice, at least, they're still there and they can see and feel and touch, well, not touch, but smell at least. That hopefully that gives them a sense of social connections to some degree. Yeah, awesome. So this brings us to a fun part of the show, finally, the lightning round. And this is going to be 5 questions with quick answers, one person at a time. We're going to start with you, Dave, and then we'll circle back to Sarah to be the grand finale to close out the show. So you guys ready?
Sure.
All right, here we go. So Dave, what helps you cope when you are going through a tough time mentally?
So the very quick answer is my dog, Spencer. Speaking of attachment, and I will say that the ability to sort of process or even just relax with friends and family is just incredibly important. And sometimes that involves some science, and sometimes that involves just going out for a run with the dog. So yeah,
I love it. It totally resonates. What when you're feeling down, what type of music or song do you turn to?
Say mostly classical. I'm a big fan of piano, in particular Chopin, and I think when I'm especially down, there's sometimes a very big symphony by either like Tchaikovsky or Beethoven can just sort of snap you out, because it just sort of brings the sort of epic experience back into your mind, and I think that can be sort of inspirational when you're feeling especially down or tragic. Yeah.
Yeah, that's fantastic. It kind of takes you into another space. That's amazing. Yeah. What's a hobby or activity that helps you unwind and de-stress?
So I will say running, definitely. It does for me at least have sort of that meditative component, which I really enjoy. It's probably the second most productive in terms of thinking too, because you can kind of just that term entering the zone is so true, and I think. As a close second, I would say it's probably a toss-up between reading or just sometimes just listening to a good piece of music. To go back to your early question, yeah.
Awesome. And have you discovered any books or films or television media that have inspired you in particular during the pandemic?
So actually, yeah, it's kind of twofold. I kind of went back to some of the old authors that I used to read. Like I actually started rereading and reading more of Flaubert's work. Like I'm right now working on sentimental education. And then kind of, I like some like Russian fiction, Vladimir Sorokin is one. And then my sister-in-law actually turned me on to a relatively new author, Brandon Taylor's book. He speaks about being a sort of an African-American grad student growing up in the Midwest. And so, yeah, I think those have been really just interesting in multiple domains, sort of going back to the classics, but also thinking a little bit more modern.
Yeah, learning about those deep dimensions of human experience that we can't necessarily experience directly, but vicariously at the very least, we can learn from them. Amazing. And then what gives you hope?
And that's kind of a twofold answer. I think there's the day-to-day aspect, just kind of thinking about, especially in the context of the pandemic, just how much people have risen to the occasion in sort of the most subtle, but also just very elementary and basic ways. Which really does, I think, just speak to the fact that people can and do, more importantly. And then I also think, just the sort of the leaps, right? I think that both as a scientist and I think personally, like you see that there are major transitions that really are for the better, even though they often come with a lot of work or a lot of time, whether we're talking about science, and a lot of difficulty if we're sort of talking about things globally. So, I think that, the arc of justice, sort of does come through. And I think that does sort of keep me going, at least.
Fantastic. And we are seeing that happen in science. So amazing. Sarah, it's your turn.
Ooh.
What helps you cope when you're going through a tough time mentally?
I'm a wallower. So, I like to have a really good cry. And then I like to distract myself. So I spend like an hour wallowing and just feeling bad about whatever it is. And then I either, like dive into work or spend time with my family and my kids, and just distract myself.
That's great. You have that technique to cope with it. Something I try to work on is feeling fully the feelings that are coming, into my mind or my heart. I often try to distract myself too soon, I think, instead of fully feeling the feelings. So that's great to hear that you fully experience those feelings. What helps when you're feeling down? What song or type of music do you turn to?
Yeah, so because I'm a wallower, I like to listen to really sad songs. So yeah, so I love Sufjan Stevens, and especially like his I think it was his latest album, Carrie and Lowell, which was about the death of his mother. That's like a great cathartic album for me. So yeah, I like things that let me like get my feelings out so I can sort of then, process them and move on.
Yeah, that catharsis can be really important. What's a hobby or activity that helps you unwind and de-stress?
I wish it was running, but it's not, because I'm really not athletic. So for me, it's probably baking. I think, it's like a lot like science. There's like a recipe and you follow it, but there's something about baking where like, I mean, I guess it's true of experiments also. It turns out different every time. And so I find that aspect to be like really calming for me, and I get to eat it afterwards. So it's a win-win.
Fantastic. And I bet you share it with your family or other folks too that like it too.
I do bake a lot for other people.
Yeah, that's wonderful. Did you discover any new books, films, or television media that particularly inspired you during the pandemic?
Yeah, I would say, unfortunately for me, not really, because I only watch what my kids watch now. So unless we're counting like shows like Bluey, probably not much. And then, once they're in bed, I'm usually at that point just looking for something lighthearted. So mostly rewatching old comedies that just let me sort of forget about the day.
I totally get it. My wife and I often rewatch comedy specials by like Jim Gaffigan or Kathleen Madigan on Netflix or Prime at the end of the day to unwind. And what gives you hope?
Yeah, I think a lot of it is like my scientific colleagues. I think that I find a lot of hope in the fact that there's so many people that I know that are trying to improve the world. And I have a lot of friends and family who are in healthcare, so that also gives me a lot of hope. And then like watching my kids, like, like kids are so innocent and, they see the world in such a pure way. Like if you talk to them about things like climate change, they're just like, well, let's, stop doing all those bad things. So, seeing them and hoping that they will continue to make the world a better place is what sort of keeps me going.
That is beautiful. That warms my heart. So thanks, Sarah, and thank you, Dave. Thanks to you both for sharing what you shared today with our viewers. And viewers, thank you too for watching. We also have a moment where we're going to turn to our team at One Mind Cyber Guide for their review of an app that can actually, through the use of personalized tools and daily meditations, potentially help with anxiety. So take it away, Cyber Guide team. This app is called Shine.
Hi, I'm Christy Palomares, and I'm a digital mental health specialist at One Mind Cyber Guide. There are a few different things to look out for when choosing an app that's right for you. One of them is user experience. User experience means the overall experience you get when using an app or program. For example, is it easy, fun, engaging, and interesting to use? Even if an app is likely to work, if it's difficult to use and navigate, has bugs or glitches, or isn't visually appealing, you may not use it long enough to reap its benefits. Looking at screenshots of the app in the App Store can help give you an idea of the look and feel of the app before you download it. Some people use a trial and error method of choosing apps. They download some apps, try them for a little while, and figure out if they like them. OneMind CyberGuide also provides information on the user experience of mental health apps. Apps on our app guide are rated by experts and people with lived experience using the mobile app rating scale. This gives an objective score out of 5, which can help guide your app choices. Shine is a meditation app that has lots of content for communities of color and communities who have been traditionally underserved. Meditation topics include Asian American Pacific Islander mental health, Black mental health, and navigating COVID-19 anxiety. Shine has a really strong focus on representation and has a diverse range of narrators and presenters for meditation content. When you first open Shine, you can select a goal from a provided list and then receive a personalized meditation playlist. You can also log and track your mood and journal based on prompts provided. You can access content for free or upgrade to a premium subscription for additional content and access to an inclusive community. Premium subscription costs $14.99 per month. Check out the review of Shine on the OneMind CyberGuide app guide. It receives a score of 2.67 out of 5 on credibility and 3.89 out of 5 on user experience. It also has an acceptable score on transparency. Thanks for listening. Remember to visit us at onemindcyberguide.org to learn more about apps to help you manage your mental health and wellness.
Thank you, CyberGuide team. And thanks again to you, Dave, and you, Sarah. And also thank you to Branford Marsalis and Joey Calderosso for their performance they shared on our show today. Viewers, again, thank you so much for participating in our show. Really love having you watch and participate. And don't forget, you can check out all of our past Brainwaves episodes and also subscribe to our newsletter where you can learn about upcoming Brainwaves episodes at onemind.org/brainwaves. So remember, what is your brain good for? Making waves, of course. Bye. Thanks for watching. See you next week.
Mental health is stepping out of the shadows and into the spotlight.
I think I need help.
Can you talk?
Struggling.
I'm here.
Depressed. Can't sleep.
But we need the science and solutions to change lives. Now, more than ever, we are in this fight together. We are of one mind, accelerating brain health for all. Help us fund new treatments at onemind.org.